August 1944, Normandy, France. The greatest invasion force in human history had been grinding forward for 6 long weeks, and it was starting to bleed out in the French countryside. Everything the Allies hoped for on D-Day, speed, momentum, a rapid drive inland, had dissolved into smoke, mud, and thousands of fresh graves stretching across wheat fields. British and Canadian troops were locked in a brutal struggle around the city of Caen. They advanced a few hundred yards one day, only to lose the same ground the next. The air stank of cordite and burnt metal, and every hedgerow hid another German machine gun nest waiting to tear young men apart. American forces in the Bocage country faced the same nightmare. Narrow lanes turning into killing funnels, fields soaked with blood, and snipers watching from every farmhouse window. Casualties soared. Entire battalions were reduced to shadows of themselves. Commanders whispered the one word no general dared say aloud: stalemate. Something was terribly wrong. The Allies had the numbers. They had the tanks. They had total air superiority. And yet, they were dying faster than the Germans and gaining almost nothing. Behind the front lines, frustration was turning into desperation. Every day, generals promised progress. Every day, the casualty lists only grew longer. Something fundamental in the Allied strategy was broken, fatally broken, and no one seemed willing to admit it. No one except one man. A man the Germans quietly feared more than any American commander. A man the British distrusted, the Americans barely noticed, and even his own soldiers often disliked. A cold, calculating Canadian general who saw the battlefield differently from everyone else. And while the Allied advance stalled in the ruins of Normandy, he was the only one asking the question everyone else was too afraid to face. What if the real problem wasn't German strength, but Allied thinking? The battles around Caen had become a slow, choking grind. What was supposed to be a rapid breakout across open countryside had turned into a brutal contest of attrition, fought hedge by hedge, field by field. The city itself, once a key objective for D-Day, now stood half-ruined and surrounded, a symbol of how far the Allied advance had stalled. Canadian and British units launched attack after attack, but every assault met the same fate. A few hundred yards gained, hundreds of men lost. German defenders had turned every patch of farmland into a fortress. Machine guns were dug into sunken lanes. Anti-tank guns were hidden behind farm walls. Mortars were zeroed in on every approach road. Any soldier who lifted his head above wheat stalks risked dying instantly. To the west, American forces fought through the infamous Bocage, dense hedgerows that turned Normandy into a maze. Tanks couldn't see more than a few feet ahead. Infantry couldn't tell if the next row of brush hid empty farmland or an ambush waiting to erupt at point-blank range. The results were catastrophic. For every German killed, 3 Allied soldiers died. The casualty reports arrived daily, names typed on thin sheets of paper, accumulating in stacks inside command tents. Officers stopped reading them line by line. They skimmed, they swallowed hard, and they told themselves they'd try again tomorrow. But privately, the fear grew. What if this was it? What if Normandy was turning into another trench war? Another 1916, another deadlock of endless death for inches of ground. Commanders spoke softly when they said it, only when the tent flaps were closed and no junior officers could overhear. Stalemate. A word the Allies were never supposed to face again. A word that could doom the entire invasion if somebody didn't find a way to break it. To understand why the Allies were struggling in Normandy, you have to understand who was leading them. The commanders shaping the battle were men forged in the trenches of World War I. They came from a generation that believed leadership wasn't just earned in combat. It was inherited through tradition. Officers were expected to come from the right families, attend the right schools, speak with the right accents, and behave according to a system built long before tanks and aircraft existed. Most of them had spent years fighting in mud-filled trenches where men moved slowly, artillery dominated everything, and infantry tactics focused on massed daylight assaults. That mindset, rigid, predictable, and painfully outdated, still guided their decisions in 1944. To them, warfare was a sequence of set-piece operations, artillery barrage, infantry advance, tanks follow behind, repeat. It was the only way they knew how to fight. Even as the battlefield changed, many Allied generals held tightly to old habits. They trusted routine more than innovation. They valued proper military upbringing more than raw talent. They preferred officers who looked like leaders rather than those who questioned long-held assumptions. But Normandy wasn't a battlefield for tradition. It was fast, brutal, and shaped by new weapons, new terrain, and a new kind of enemy. German forces used flexible tactics, rapid counterattacks, hidden anti-tank positions, and expert camouflage. They adapted quickly. The Allies did not. Instead of adjusting, many commanders doubled down on the familiar, assuming that sheer numbers and firepower would eventually overwhelm the Germans, just like in 1918. But this time, the price of stubborn thinking wasn't measured in trenches or yards of mud. It was measured in thousands of young men dying on sunlit fields that should never have been attacked in daylight. Normandy needed a new kind of leader, someone willing to break the rules everyone else clung to. Into this world of tradition and trench war thinking stepped a man who didn't fit anywhere, Lieutenant General Guy Simonds, a commander the Allied hierarchy neither expected nor wanted. He was young by general standards, just 41 years old. He came from a middle-class family with no aristocratic lineage, no military dynasty behind his name. His father was a British immigrant who struggled financially. Simonds didn't attend elite schools, didn't come from a polished officer background, and had never commanded troops in actual combat before 1943. In an army defined by old pathways to power, he was an anomaly. British staff officers whispered about him constantly. Some mocked him for his cold demeanor. Others dismissed him outright because he didn't fit the image of what a proper general was supposed to look like. Behind his back, they gave him a nickname, the mathematical soldier. Not as praise, but as an insult. He spoke in precise, clipped sentences. He saw the battlefield not as a stage for heroism, but as a series of interconnected problems. Numbers, angles, timings, casualty probabilities. To some, it made him brilliant. To others, it made him unsettling. Even his own Canadian officers respected him cautiously. They admired his competence, but not his personality. Simonds rarely smiled, never raised his voice, and kept emotion sealed behind an icy exterior. Soldiers said being near him felt like standing next to a machine that thought and calculated, but never felt. And yet, beneath that cold exterior was a relentless mind that saw what others couldn't. While senior commanders clung to outdated doctrines, Simonds studied the battlefield with surgical precision. Each report he read, each pattern he observed, pulled him further from tradition and deeper into a new way of thinking, one that challenged everything the Allies believed about how war should be fought. In a command structure built on tradition, Guy Simonds was a disruptive force, an outsider, unwanted, underestimated, and frequently disliked. But in the killing fields of Normandy, that outsider would soon become the only man capable of seeing the truth that everyone else had missed. For many soldiers, serving under Guy Simonds felt unsettling. Not because he was cruel, not because he demanded blind loyalty, but because he treated war with the cold precision of an engineer solving a physics problem. Simonds didn't talk about glory. He didn't tell heroic speeches. He didn't promise victory through courage alone. Instead, he spoke in numbers, force ratios, casualty projections, logistical timings, rates of fire. To him, soldiers were not symbols of bravery. They were resources, critical, valuable, irreplaceable resources, but resources nonetheless. Every man lost was a calculation, not a tragedy expressed in emotional words. Officers who sat at his briefings came away uneasy. He didn't sugarcoat risk. He didn't hide brutal math behind patriotic language. If a battalion needed to take a position, Simonds calculated, down to the dozen, how many men would die doing it, and he delivered that number without hesitation or emotion. Some commanders tried to soften their words for morale. Simonds never did. One officer described him sharply. He would sacrifice a battalion to save a division without blinking. Not because he was heartless, but because he refused to lie about the cost of war. To his men, this made him terrifying. To fellow generals, it made him unpredictable. To traditionalists, it made him dangerous. But beneath that chilling clarity was something almost no one noticed at the time. Simonds wasn't calculating how many men he could spend. He was calculating how many he could save. His cold logic, the very trait that made people fear him, was the key to what would come next. It allowed him to see patterns others ignored, to question doctrines others treated as sacred, and to design solutions others believed impossible. And in the dying fields of Normandy, that cold logic was about to reshape the future of armored warfare. The breaking point came on a scorching July afternoon during the assault on Verrières Ridge, a rise of high ground the Germans had fortified with ruthless precision. From its slopes, they could see everything. Every tank that moved, every infantryman who lifted his head above the wheat fields. It was a perfect killing ground. Despite the risks, Allied commanders ordered a daylight attack. It was the same formula they had used countless times before. Artillery barrage, infantry advance, tanks follow, push forward under the sun, and once again, it ended in slaughter. Canadian units advanced into open fields flooded with sunlight, visible from miles away. German anti-tank guns waited in concealed positions, firing with deadly accuracy. Machine guns swept the wheat in long, merciless bursts. Mortars burst overhead like thunder. Within minutes, chaos replaced formation. The Black Watch Regiment, 325 men strong, marched forward with courage beyond words. By the end of the day, 324 were dead or wounded. Only one man walked away unhurt. Tanks burned across the landscape, black smoke twisting into the sky. Crews died trapped inside metal coffins. Bodies lay scattered between the wheat stalks and cratered earth. It was one of the most devastating Canadian losses of the entire war. That night, in a dimly lit command tent, Guy Simonds sat alone at a wooden table. A small lamp cast a circle of weak light over stacks of casualty reports. He read them quietly, page after page. No outburst, no speech, just cold, heavy silence. The numbers were horrific. The waste of life, the utter futility, was undeniable. And for the first time, even Simonds felt it. This could not continue. The old methods were killing thousands of men for nothing. The Germans weren't winning because they were better soldiers or had better equipment. They were winning because they could see the Allied attacks coming. In that silent tent, surrounded by death lists, Guy Simonds realized something that would change not just the battle for Normandy, but the future of modern warfare. As Simonds studied the reports from Verrières Ridge, a simple but revolutionary truth crystallized in his mind, something so obvious that no one had dared to consider it. The Allies weren't losing because the Germans were stronger, nor because their equipment was inferior, nor because their soldiers lacked courage. They were losing because they were visible. Every major Allied assault followed the same pattern: attack in daylight after an artillery barrage. Across terrain, the Germans had already measured and prepared. German observers perched on ridgelines or hidden in church towers could see Allied forces assemble, see them advance, and call down precise fire long before the attackers reached their positions. It was World War I, thinking replayed on a World War II battlefield. Slow, predictable, exposed, suicidal. Simonds understood something no one else had the courage to say. The problem wasn't the soldiers. It wasn't the terrain. It wasn't even the enemy. The problem was the doctrine. If the Germans could see the attacks, they could kill the attackers. It was that simple. So Simonds asked a question that broke every rule in the Allied playbook. What if we stop attacking when the enemy can see us? What if tanks moved in total darkness? What if infantry rode inside armored carriers, not behind them? What if bombers struck just minutes before armored vehicles arrived, not hours? What if an entire corps, hundreds of tanks and thousands of men, advanced under a new moon? Every manual said it was impossible. Night was chaos. Darkness meant confusion, friendly fire, and disaster. But Simonds had seen enough daylight bloodshed. If the cost of innovation was breaking the rules, then the rules were going to break. In that moment, everything changed. The path to victory wouldn't be found in tradition, but in darkness. Simonds didn't just propose a new idea. He designed an operation unlike anything the world had ever seen. A plan so complex, so bold, and so far outside accepted doctrine that most officers believed it bordered on madness. He called it Operation Totalize, and it would become the world's first major night-armored assault. The scale alone was staggering. Simonds ordered 720 armored vehicles, tanks, self-propelled guns, and specialized carriers, organized into 4 massive columns. Each column would advance in perfect formation through total darkness under a moonless sky. No headlights, no flares, no guiding landmarks, just compasses, training, and nerves of steel. But darkness created a new problem: infantry. Walking behind tanks at night was suicide. Units would get lost, separated, or cut down by machine guns, like always. So Simonds did something no Allied commander had ever attempted. He told his engineers to take M7 Priest self-propelled guns, cut out the main 105mm cannons, and transform them into armored troop carriers. A crude idea, almost desperate, but brilliant. They were called Kangaroos, the first armored personnel carriers in military history. In just 6 days, Canadian engineers welded, cut, bolted, and reinforced 76 of them. These hulking metal boxes could carry a dozen infantrymen safely through firestorms that would have killed them in seconds if they were walking. Then came the next innovation: timing. Minutes, literally minutes, before the tanks rolled out, Simonds ordered 1,020 heavy bombers to carpet bomb German positions. not hours before, like standard doctrine, minutes. The idea was to stun, blind, and disorient German defenders so completely that they wouldn't recover before the armor struck. But coordinating hundreds of tanks through darkness required redundancy on top of redundancy. So Simonds built a multi-layered navigation system, colored tracer rounds fired continuously to mark each column's boundaries, radio beacons placed every 1,000 yards, Bofors anti-aircraft guns firing at fixed intervals to act as visual reference points, compass updates every 500 yards, 72 hours of non-stop night driving training for all tank crews. It was a masterpiece of planning. Mathematical, precise, unforgiving. And when Simonds presented it, many officers stared at him as if he had lost his mind. You want tanks to fight at night? You want bombers dropping bombs minutes before they arrive? You want infantry riding inside artillery hulls? To most, it sounded insane. To Simonds, it sounded like the only way to save thousands of lives. The moment Simonds revealed Operation Totalize, the room turned cold. British armor commanders stared at the plans in disbelief. They weren't just skeptical, they were alarmed. Every major principle of armored warfare said the same thing. Tanks fight in daylight. Visibility mattered, coordination mattered, and darkness was the enemy of both. To them, Simonds' plan wasn't bold. It was suicidal. They warned him bluntly and repeatedly that he was about to create the greatest friendly fire disaster of the entire war. They argued that tanks would crash into each other in the dark. Infantry would fire on their own men. Units would get lost, separated or ambushed. Bombers dropping explosives so close to friendly lines, one miscalculation and entire regiments would be vaporized. Montgomery's chief of staff reviewed the proposal and called it fantastically complicated and impossibly risky. Engineers said the kangaroos might break down or trap men inside. Artillery officers worried the tracer boundaries would fail. Communication staff feared radio beacons wouldn't transmit through smoke and debris. Some commanders openly predicted the Canadian Corps would be wiped out in a single night. But Simonds didn't flinch. He listened to every objection without expression. He acknowledged the risks. He understood the fears. Then he said what none of them wanted to hear. If we keep fighting this way, we will lose far more men in daylight than we ever will in the dark. There was no plan B, no slower, safer approach, no comfortable alternative. The stakes could not be higher. If Operation Totalize failed, it would destroy the Canadian Corps, and possibly Simonds' career. If it succeeded, it would rewrite the rules of modern warfare. Simonds chose to move forward. The night was waiting. August 7th, 1944. 11:30 p.m. The world above Normandy was black, so dark that the sky and the ground seemed to blend together into one endless void. No moon, no stars, only silence, smoke, and the smell of burning wheat drifting on a faint night wind. Then, the earth began to shake. 1,020 heavy bombers roared overhead, their engines rumbling like a distant storm. A moment later, the night exploded in a rolling cascade of fire. Thousands of tons of bombs slammed into German positions, craters erupting in flashes of white-orange light, shockwaves rippling across the fields. Houses disintegrated, trees snapped like matchsticks. Entire defensive lines vanished under clouds of dust and shattered stone. And just minutes after the last bomb fell, the rumble of another sound began rising through the darkness. Engines, hundreds of them. The Canadians were moving, Simonds' armored columns rolled forward in perfect formation, their treads grinding softly across scorched fields still glowing from the bombing runs. But unlike every other attack in Normandy, these tanks used no headlights, no lamps, no visible signals. They moved like shadows with weight, silhouettes barely visible even a few feet away. Tank commanders leaned out of their hatches, eyes searching the darkness, watching for the colored tracer rounds fired overhead. Red on one side of their advance, green on the other, each line marking invisible boundaries in the black void. Inside the new Kangaroo carriers, infantrymen sat shoulder to shoulder in total darkness. They could hear everything but see nothing. The rumbling engines, the clanking treads, the crackle of burning fields, and far off, the muffled confusion of German defenders scrambling awake. Those German soldiers were completely unprepared. They expected attacks at dawn. They expected time to assemble. They expected to see the enemy first. Instead, they emerged from bunkers choking on dust and smoke, ears ringing from the bombings, only to hear something terrifying. Engines, getting closer, fast. Before many could even grab their rifles, the first wave of Canadian armor had already passed them, silent, dark, unstoppable. Confused radio messages crackled through German lines. Enemy armor, direction unknown. They're inside our lines. We can't see them. Where are they coming from? Officers tried to coordinate counterattacks, but nothing made sense. Their maps were useless. Their defensive lines were shattered. Their observation posts destroyed. Their anti-tank teams couldn't find targets in the blackness. The front was dissolving in real time, swallowed by the night. For the first time since D-Day, the Germans weren't dictating the battle. They were blind, they were stunned, and they were terrified. The Canadians, moving like metal ghosts, pushed deeper into German territory than any Allied force had managed in weeks. And they did it in hours. By dawn, the dust was settling over Normandy, and commanders began receiving reports that didn't seem possible. The Canadians had advanced 6 miles, a distance that previous operations had taken 3 weeks to achieve. This time, they had done it before sunrise. German defensive lines, which had held firm against wave after wave of daylight assaults, had collapsed in a matter of hours. Positions overrun, anti-tank guns abandoned, artillery units scattered or destroyed. Entire formations simply vanished into the night, unable to regroup or counterattack. But the most shocking revelation came when casualty figures were compiled. The losses were 1/4 of what commanders had braced for, a 75% reduction. 2 out of every 3 men who would have died in daylight were still alive. For the first time since landing in Normandy, the kill ratios flipped. Instead of Germans killing 3 Allied soldiers for every one of their own, the Canadians were now inflicting disproportionate losses on the enemy. Night had neutralized the Germans' greatest advantage, visibility. Without their observers, without clear lines of fire, without coordinated counterattacks, even elite German units struggled to understand what was happening, let alone resist it. And inside the Canadian Corps, something unprecedented spread through the ranks. Momentum. Armored units were still pushing forward at sunrise, pressing deeper before the Germans could reorganize. Infantry were arriving at objectives ahead of schedule, protected inside kangaroos instead of dying in open fields. Tank crews, accustomed to seeing friends burn in daylight battles, now reported far fewer losses and far more successful engagements. The math spoke for itself. The doctrine was undeniable. Operation Totalize had done what everyone said was impossible: break fortified German lines, advance faster than any recent Allied attack, save thousands of lives, and rewrite the rules of armored warfare. Simonds' cold logic had produced results that no speech, no tradition, and no old doctrine ever could. If Operation Totalize had only shattered German lines, it would have been impressive. But what came afterward was something far more rare in war: fear. Not fear among Allied troops, fear among German commanders, the very officers who had humiliated Allied operations for weeks. In the days after Totalize, German intelligence units compiled internal, classified after-action reports. These documents were never meant for propaganda, never meant for public eyes. They were written for senior officers, cold, honest assessments of real threats. And in those reports, one name appeared with disturbing consistency: General Guy Simonds. German officers had studied every Allied commander in Normandy. They knew Potton, Bradley, Montgomery, their tactics, their habits, their patterns. But after the night assault, something changed. They began warning each other specifically about the Canadian Corps. One internal German analysis read, "This Canadian commander understands armored warfare better than any British or American general we have faced." Not praise, not flattery. Just the sober admission of professionals who suddenly realized they had underestimated the wrong man. The most chilling assessment came from SS General Kurt Panzer Meyer, commander of the elite 12th SS Panzer Division. Meyer was no ordinary officer. He was one of Germany's most experienced and feared armored leaders. Years later, writing his memoirs, he remembered Simonds with an unsettling respect. Simonds was the most dangerous opponent I encountered. He was ice-cold, calculating, and always several moves ahead. For an SS Panzer commander to write that, after fighting American and British divisions for years, said more than any Allied medal ever could. German commanders were so shaken by Simonds' night attack that they issued standing orders to all units facing the Canadian Corps: maintain 50% alert status at all hours, especially at night. In other words, stay awake, stay ready. You never know when the Canadians will come. It exhausted their troops, it disrupted their sleep cycles, it weakened their ability to fight. Simonds had done the unthinkable. He forced the Germans to fear not just the battlefield, but the dark itself. Operation Totalize wasn't a lucky break or a one-time miracle. It was the beginning of a new pattern, one that would make Guy Simonds the most quietly dangerous commander on the Western Front. Just a week after Totalize, he launched Operation Tractable, another massive offensive built on the same principles: darkness, surprise, armored speed, and ruthless precision. This time, the objective was the Falaise Pocket, a trap that could seal the fate of tens of thousands of German troops retreating east. Simonds again coordinated bombers, artillery, armor, and infantry with mathematical accuracy. He pushed his forces forward in a relentless, controlled squeeze, closing the pocket from the north, while American and Polish units pressed from the south. The result was catastrophic for the Germans. 50,000 soldiers were killed or captured. Entire divisions ceased to exist. The German 7th Army was effectively broken. This wasn't luck. This wasn't chance. It was cold logic executed to perfection. But Simonds wasn't finished. Next came his most daring challenge yet: the Battle of the Scheldt, a brutal campaign across flooded fields, mudflats, and waterways, guarding the approaches to the port of Antwerp. British commanders declared the mission impossible. too much water, too many gun positions, too many natural obstacles. Simonds ignored the doubts. He designed a complex amphibious assault using waterproof tanks, artillery firing across tidal waters, and tracked amphibious vehicles called buffaloes. His forces advanced through icy waves under heavy artillery fire in conditions that should have shattered morale. But the logic held. German defenses buckled, key fortifications collapsed, and the port of Antwerp, vital for supplying the entire Allied advance into Europe, was finally opened. By now, a pattern was clear. Where other commanders saw obstacles, Simonds saw problems to be solved. Where others hesitated, he recalculated. Where others followed doctrine, he rewrote it. His innovations weren't just working. They were becoming unstoppable. With successes piling up, you might expect Guy Simonds to become a household name, celebrated on magazine covers, praised in speeches, admired by the Allied public. But that never happened. Simonds had none of the ingredients that made World War II generals famous. He wasn't charismatic. He didn't pose well for photographs. He didn't shout bold lines or give fiery speeches. He didn't swagger or play to the cameras. In an era where personality often overshadowed performance, he simply didn't look or sound like the hero the world wanted. Across the Atlantic, American newspapers fell in love with Patton, the hard-charging general with ivory-handled pistols, quotable lines, and a personality big enough to fill headlines. His flamboyance was irresistible. His stories sold papers. His image became legend. The British loved Montgomery, calm, aristocratic, impeccably dressed, and publicly confident. He fit perfectly into the British imagination of what a commander should be. Composed, articulate, dignified. He looked like a general straight from central casting. But Simonds? He stood stiffly in photos, expression blank, eyes calculated. His press briefings were dry, technical, and emotionless. He talked about casualty ratios instead of glory. He explained operations using mathematics instead of metaphors. Reporters didn't know what to do with a man like that. He wasn't dramatic. He wasn't quotable. He wasn't marketable. So while he reshaped modern warfare from the shadows, the spotlight drifted elsewhere. Patton became a legend. Montgomery became iconic. Their personalities built myths larger than the battles themselves. Simonds built results, quietly, efficiently, relentlessly. And that is the uncomfortable truth history reveals. Fame follows charisma. Recognition follows personality. But victory follows competence. Simonds gave the Allies breakthroughs, innovations, and lowered casualty counts. Yet the world barely remembered his name. Because in war and in history, people often celebrate the generals who sound heroic, not the ones who saved the most lives. What Guy Simonds accomplished in Normandy didn't end on those burned fields. His ideas spread, quietly at first, then globally, until they shaped the entire modern battlefield. Start with the kangaroos, those crude armored carriers, welded together in a desperate 6-day sprint, became the blueprint for every armored personnel carrier that followed. The American M113, used from Vietnam to Iraq, directly followed the kangaroo's concept: move infantry under armor, not behind it. The Soviet BTR series, iconic throughout the Cold War, used the same logic. Even the Israeli Merkava tank, designed with a rear compartment for infantry, embodied the principle Simonds pioneered. Infantry and armor must move as one, not separately, not exposed, together. And then there was night warfare. Before Simonds, tanks fought in daylight because doctrine said so. After Simonds, armies across the world began training and preparing for night assaults. By the time of the 1991 Gulf War, American armored divisions advanced through darkness with thermal sights and GPS. But the core idea was pure Simonds. Attack when the enemy cannot see you. Modern armored doctrine, whether American, British, Russian, Israeli, or NATO-wide, echoes his core philosophy. Surprise, speed, protected mobility, integrated air support, and precise coordination. This is combined arms, the backbone of every major modern military force. Artillery doesn't act alone. Infantry doesn't act alone. Tanks don't act alone. Air power doesn't act alone. They operate as one synchronized machine, just as Simonds envisioned in 1944. Even today, officers at West Point, Sandhurst, and NATO academies still study Operation Totalize as a model of innovation under pressure. His navigation techniques, his integration of armor and infantry, his operational timing, they're all standard training material now. Simonds may not have become famous. He may not have commanded public attention. He may not have fit the heroic mold. But his fingerprint is on every modern battlefield, every armored assault, every mechanized breakthrough, every doctrine taught to the next generation of commanders. He didn't just change one battle. He changed how the world fights wars. In the end, Guy Simonds never got the fame his achievements deserved. There were no cheering crowds waiting when he returned home. No Hollywood films, no best-selling memoirs, not even a fraction of the recognition given to other Allied generals, some of whom accomplished far less. But numbers don't lie, and the numbers tell a story history almost forgot. Under Simonds' command, the Canadian Corps advanced farther, faster, and with fewer casualties per mile than nearly any comparable formation in Northwest Europe. His innovations protected infantry, who would have otherwise died walking behind tanks in daylight. His night assaults saved thousands of young men from becoming nothing more than names on casualty sheets. His decisions, cold, calculated, precise, kept families from receiving the telegram no parent or wife ever wants to read. He didn't inspire troops with speeches. He didn't win the press with swagger. He didn't build a public image. He simply got results. And the people who understood those results best weren't the journalists or the politicians. It was the enemy. German officers, men hardened by years of fighting on every front, wrote in private and classified reports that Simonds was the most dangerous Allied commander they faced. They respected him. They feared him. They studied him. They warned their troops about him specifically. Not Patton, not Montgomery, not Bradley. Simonds, because he fought differently, because he thought differently, because he broke the rules that everyone else accepted until thousands of men paid the price. That is his real legacy, not medals, not headlines, but lives. Lives saved by a general who cared more about outcomes than admiration. History may have overlooked him. The public may have forgotten his name, but the Germans never did. And in that truth lies the quiet, uncomfortable lesson of his life. History forgot him. His enemies never did.